The auctioneer called the mare a lost cause, then a cowboy refused to walk away. The gavel never fell. That's the first thing you need to understand about what happened in that dusty sale barn on the edge of Coburn County. The auctioneer's hand froze in midair, hovering over the block, because for 3 full seconds, nobody in that crowded room made a sound. Not the ranchers leaning on the rails. Not the buyers with their numbered paddles. Not even the horse. She stood in the center ring with her head low, ribs pressing against to hide the color of old rust and rain, and she was shaking, not from cold, though the morning was cold enough to fog every breath in that tin-roofed barn, but from something deeper. Something that lived in her muscles. Her ears were pinned flat. Her eyes, when you could see them past the tangled forelock, held that particular kind of stillness that isn't calm at all. It's the stillness of an animal that has already decided the world is not safe, and never will be again. Lot 47. The auctioneer had called, half-heartedly, like he already knew how this would go. Grade mare, age unknown, temperament. Well, folks, you can see for yourselves. Nobody bid. If you've ever watched an animal get written off by a room full of strangers, you know the sound silence makes. It isn't peaceful. It's heavy. It presses down on your chest. And that's exactly where our story begins, because somewhere in the back of that barn, leaning against a support post with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed, a man who hadn't raised his hand at an auction in over 2 years was about to do something nobody expected, least of all himself. Stay with me, because what this man did next, and what he would discover 3 weeks later, hidden beneath a saddle blanket in his own barn, would change both of their lives forever. If stories like this move you, you'll want to see this one through to the end. The man's name was Jess Calloway, and if you'd asked anyone in that county to describe him, they'd have used words like quiet and steady, and, if they'd known him longer than a season, not the same as he used to be. Jess ran a modest spread called Larkspur Ranch, 40 acres of scrub grass and stubborn fence line about 6 miles outside of town. He used to be known for something specific, for taking horses nobody else wanted and finding the animal that was still in there, underneath the fear. People used to drive 2 counties over just to ask his advice on a horse that wouldn't load, wouldn't trust, wouldn't let a saddle near its back. Used to. For 2 years, Jess hadn't touched a lead rope that wasn't already broke gentle. He came to auctions to sell hay and buy feed, not to bid on lost causes. The town understood why, mostly, even if they didn't say it out loud. 2 years ago, his wife Ellen, the real horsewoman of the family, the one with the patient hands and the singing voice she used on nervous yearlings, had gotten sick in that fast, cruel way that doesn't give you time to prepare, and by the time the leaves turned that October, Larkspur Ranch had gone quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. So when Jess Calloway pushed off that support post and walked toward the auction ring, an old friend named Earl Whitfield grabbed his sleeve. Jess. Don't. Earl. That mare bit clean through Denny Cutter's glove yesterday. Put a stall door off its hinges the day before that. She's not green, Jess. She's ruined. Earl's voice dropped lower. I know what you're doing. And I know why. But this ain't the one. Jess didn't answer right away. He was watching the mare's eyes. He'd spent 30 years reading horses the way other men read weather, and what he saw in that half-starved, half-wild animal wasn't meanness. It was fear wearing meanness like a coat 2 sizes too big, because fear was the only thing left that had kept her alive this long. $50, Jess said. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, not cruel, exactly, just the tired kind of laughter people use when they've already made peace with an outcome. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Hollis Pratt who'd been calling sales in that barn for 30 years, raised an eyebrow like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. I got 50. Do I hear 60? Anybody? She's a big mare, good bone under all that, anybody? 50 going once. Nobody else moved. Nobody else wanted her. Sold. Lot 47, to the gentleman in the back, for $50. And that was it. $75 in Jess's pocket a minute later. Hollis had knocked a little more off just to get the sale done, and to get that mare out of a ring she'd already half destroyed with her panic, and just like that, Jess Calloway owned a horse that everyone else in that barn had already given up on. He'd find out later just how literally true that was. But first, he had to get her home. And getting her home was where things very nearly went wrong before they'd even had the chance to go right. Loading a terrified 1,500-pound animal into a 2-horse trailer is not a gentle process under the best of circumstances, and this was nowhere close to the best of circumstances. The mare planted all 4 feet at the base of the ramp like she'd turned to stone. When Earl, who'd come along despite himself, muttering the whole time about stubborn old fools, tried to add pressure from behind with a lunge line, she exploded. She reared straight up, hooves slashing at empty air, and came down sideways into the trailer's steel frame. A gash opened along her near foreleg, blood welling dark against rust-colored hide, and for one terrible second Jess thought they were about to lose her right there in the gravel lot, before she'd even left the place that had already broken her once. "Easy," Jess said, and it wasn't a command. It was barely above a whisper. "Easy, girl. Nobody's gonna hurt you here. Not anymore." He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach out. He just lowered himself down onto one knee in the gravel, 6 feet away, and waited, while blood ran down the mare's leg and Elle hissed that they needed a vet right now, and something in the way Jess simply stopped, simply stayed low and still and unhurried, made the mare's wild eye flicker toward him instead of away. It took another 40 minutes. But she loaded. And if you're wondering whether that gash in her leg was the last time this story would have you holding your breath, it wasn't even close. Because 3 days later, Jess would learn exactly why that mare fought so hard against a simple ramp and a simple trailer, and the answer would break his heart in a way he hadn't expected to feel again. The drive back to Larkspur Ranch was quiet except for the occasional thud of a hoof against the trailer wall. Not panic anymore, just exhaustion. When Jess finally backed the trailer up to the round pen and dropped the ramp, the mare wouldn't come out. She stood in that trailer for 6 hours. Earl left around sunset, shaking his head, telling Jess he was a stubborn old fool who ought to know better than to invite more heartbreak into a house that had already seen enough of it. Jess didn't argue with him. He just pulled a folding chair out of the barn, set it up 10 feet from the open trailer door, and sat down with a thermos of coffee going cold in his hands. He stayed there until 2 in the morning. If you'd asked Jess what he was thinking about during those hours, he might not have told you the whole truth. But the truth was this: he hadn't sat vigil like this, patient, wordless, present, since the last month of Ellen's life, when the only thing left he could do for her was simply not leave. Ellen used to say that horses like this one weren't asking to be fixed. They were asking to be witnessed. To have somebody stay long enough to prove that staying was even possible. Jess had forgotten how to do that for 2 years. That night, sitting in the cold with a mare who wouldn't come out of a trailer, he remembered. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, one small sound broke the silence, a single, tentative hoofbeat on the trailer's metal floor, shifting weight forward instead of back. By 2, she'd taken her first step down the ramp. By the time the sky started going gray at the edges, she was standing in the round pen, still wild-eyed, still trembling, but out. Free of the trailer, at least, even if freedom from everything else would take a great deal longer. Jess went inside and slept for exactly 2 hours before he was back out at the pen fence, because a horse in her condition, and by daylight, her condition was plain to see, couldn't wait on anyone's exhaustion. She was painfully thin, her hip bones sharp beneath a coat matted with old dirt and dried sweat. There were scars, too, thin white lines crossing her flanks in patterns Jess recognized immediately and wished he didn't, the kind of marks left by something used more than once, and not gently. Her front teeth, when he finally got close enough days later to check, were worn strangely short for what he guessed was a mare in her prime, maybe 8 or 9 years old, a sign, he suspected, of a horse that had chewed wood fencing out of hunger or stress for longer than anyone should have allowed. He called Dr. Hannah Reyes that same morning. Hannah had been the county's go-to large animal vet for almost a decade, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken in equal measure, the kind of woman who could deliver bad news without flinching and good news without false hope. She arrived by mid-morning, took one look at the mare through the round pen rails, and let out a long breath through her nose. Where'd she come from, Jess? Sale barn. Denny Cutter consigned her. Hannah's mouth tightened at the name. Denny Cutter ran cheap horses through auctions the way other men ran cattle, buy low from desperate sellers, dump quick to whoever'd take them, kill pen bound if nobody bid at all. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't kind, either. She was headed for the kill pen after this, Hannah said quietly. Wasn't she? Jess nodded once. He hadn't known that for certain until that moment, but somewhere in his gut, he'd already guessed it. $75 didn't buy horses with futures. It bought horses with none left at all, unless somebody stepped in to write a different ending. Hannah couldn't get close enough for a full exam that first visit. The mare wouldn't allow it, striking out with a foreleg the moment anyone came within reach, but from a distance, with careful eyes and a practiced guess, she laid out what she could see. Malnourishment, moderate to severe. Old scarring consistent with repeated mistreatment. A slight hitch in the left hind that might be nothing, or might be an old injury never properly healed. And underneath all of it, a nervous system so overloaded with fear that every sudden movement, every raised hand, every unfamiliar sound sent her straight back into the kind of fight-or-flight panic that had put a gash in her leg just getting off a trailer. I won't lie to you, Jess, Hannah said, packing her bag back into her truck. Physically, she might come back around with time and groceries. But the rest of it, she glanced back at the mare, still pressed into the far corner of the pen, still watching them both like they might strike at any second. The rest of it might be more than a horse this far gone can come back from. I've seen it go both ways. I've got time, Jess said. You sure about that? It was a fair question. Because the truth was, Jess Calloway hadn't had time, hadn't made time, for anything beyond the bare minimum of keeping Larkspur Ranch standing in 2 long years. And here he was, about to pour every spare hour into an animal that might never let him close enough to touch her. But something had shifted in him standing at that pen fence, and he wasn't ready to examine too closely what it was. Not yet. The weeks that followed were not the kind of steady, uplifting progress you see in a highlight reel. They were slow. They were frustrating. Some days felt like losing ground instead of gaining it. Jess started small, simply sitting inside the round pen for an hour at a time, not looking directly at her, not reaching, just being present the way Ellen used to teach him. Horses read intention in the shoulders and the eyes long before they trust a voice, she used to say, and a man in a hurry gives himself away every time. For the first 4 days, the mare wouldn't come within 20 feet of him. On the 5th day, she took 2 steps closer before catching herself and retreating. On the 8th day, disaster nearly undid all of it. A truck backfired out on the county road, and the mare bolted so hard into the pen fence that she split a section of rail clean through and came away with a fresh cut above her eye. Jess spent that whole afternoon rebuilding fence with his hands shaking, half from the work and half from how close it had come to being so much worse. If you've ever tried to earn back trust from someone, or something, that the world taught to expect only pain, you know this part of the story. Progress isn't a straight line. It's 2 steps forward, a truck backfiring, and a whole afternoon spent wondering if you're only making things harder by staying. But Jess didn't leave. That was the part Elle couldn't quite understand, coming by every few days to check in, watching his old friend sit in the dirt of that round pen hour after hour with nothing to show for it but patience. You're not even doing anything, Elle said one evening, watching Jess simply sit 10 feet from the mare while she grazed a little closer than she had the week before. I'm doing the only thing that works, Jess said. I'm staying. It was on a Tuesday, in the 3rd week, that everything nearly fell apart for good. A storm rolled in off the ridge that afternoon, the kind of fast, violent summer storm that turns the sky the color of a fresh bruise in under 20 minutes. Jess was in the barn when the first thunder cracked, close enough to rattle the windows, and by the time he got outside, the mare was already in a full panic, running the fence line of the round pen with her eyes rolled white and her breath coming in ragged screams. She hit the fence once. Twice. On the 3rd pass, her hind leg caught in a loose section of wire near the gate, wire Jess hadn't gotten around to replacing yet, a mistake he would carry guilt over for a long time afterward, and she went down hard in the mud, thrashing, the wire biting deeper into her leg with every panicked movement. No, easy, easy. Jess was over the fence before he'd even decided to move, rain hammering down around them, and every instinct he had told him to grab her, hold her, force her still before she tore her leg open to the bone. But grabbing wasn't what this mare needed. Grabbing was exactly what she'd spent her whole life learning to fear. So instead, soaked to the skin, thunder rolling overhead, Jess dropped to his knees in the mud beside her thrashing body and did the only thing he knew how to do. He talked to her. Low, steady, unhurried, the same voice he'd have used on any spooked yearling 20 years ago, the same voice Ellen used to hum to nervous horses on stormy nights. He didn't touch the wire. He didn't touch her leg. He just stayed there, close enough that she could feel him, saying her name, the barn name he'd started calling her without even realizing it, Grace, because that was what he wished for her more than anything else, over and over, until something in the sound of it broke through the panic. She stopped thrashing. She lay there in the mud, sides heaving, wire still wrapped around her leg, and for the first time since Jess had brought her home, she let him move close enough to work the wire free with his bare, shaking hands. It took nearly 20 minutes. When the last loop of wire came loose, the mare didn't bolt. She didn't even try to stand right away. She just lay there in the rain, breathing hard, one dark eye fixed on the man kneeling beside her, and something passed between them in that look that neither one of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone else. Hannah stitched the leg the next morning. It would scar, she said, but it would heal clean. Something changed, Hannah told Jess, watching the mare stand quietly for the exam in a way she never had before, head low, but no longer flattened ears, no longer that coiled panic ready to spring. What happened out there? Jess didn't have a tidy answer. All he knew was that somewhere in the mud and the thunder, the mare had stopped fighting him and started, just barely, trusting him instead. It was 2 days later, brushing the dried mud out of her coat for the first time she'd allowed a brush anywhere near her, that Jess found it. Beneath the tangled mess of her Mare, low on her neck where a saddle blanket would usually sit, half hidden by scarring and years of neglect, was a small, faded tattoo. A Frise brand, the kind used by breeders to mark registered stock. Jess had to clean the area gently with a damp cloth before the numbers and letters became legible, and when they finally did, his hands went still. He knew that brand. It took him the better part of an hour on the phone with the breed registry, and another hour digging through a box of old paperwork he hadn't opened since Ellen died, before the pieces came together into something that knocked the breath clean out of him. The mare's registered name was Grace's Promise. She had been born at Larkspur Ranch, 11 years ago, out of a broodmare Ellen had trained and loved dearly, one of 6 young horses sold off in a single terrible week after Ellen's funeral, when Jess couldn't stand to look at another animal that reminded him of his wife's hands on their necks, her voice in their ears. He'd sold that whole crop of horses fast and cheap to a dealer he barely vetted, just to make the pain of the empty barn go quiet, and he had never once, in 2 years, let himself wonder where any of them ended up. Now he knew. One of them had ended up starved, scarred, and minutes from a kill pen, $75 away from a fate Jess would never have forgiven himself for, except that somehow, impossibly, he'd been standing in that auction barn on the one day it mattered most. He sat down hard on an overturned feed bucket, the old registration papers shaking in his hands, and for the first time in 2 years, Jess Calloway cried where something, could see him do it. Grace stood at the fence line a few feet away, watching him with that same steady dark eye, and for once, she didn't flinch away from the sound of a grown man's grief. She lowered her head instead, slow and careful, until her nose nearly brushed his shoulder. If you've made it this far into the story, you already understand why this moment matters so much, because it wasn't just a horse finding a home. It was a man finding his way back to the parts of himself he'd buried right alongside his wife. And it's exactly the kind of reunion this channel exists to tell you about, so if that means as much to you as it does to us, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened next, in front of the whole county, is the part of this story people still talk about. Word travels fast in a small county, and word of Grace's Promise, the ghost of Ellen Calloway's old bloodline, pulled back from the edge of slaughter by the very man who'd let her go, traveled faster than most. Hannah mentioned it to a friend who mentioned it to another, and within a month, the local agricultural fair board had reached out to Jess with a request that both terrified and moved him in equal measure. Every year, the county fair hosted something called the Second Chance Roundup, a small exhibition meant to spotlight rescued and rehabilitated horses, encouraging families to consider adoption instead of buying young. It wasn't a competition. There were no ribbons, no scores. Just a simple 15-minute demonstration in front of the grandstand, horse and handler working together at liberty. No ropes, no force, just trust on display for anyone willing to watch. The fair board wanted Jess and Grace to close out the show. Jess's first instinct was to say no. Grace had come further than he'd ever dared hope in those 2 months. She led well now, picked up her feet for the farrier, even nickered at the sound of his truck coming up the drive. But a crowded grandstand, loudspeakers, the particular chaos of a county fair? That was a different kind of pressure than the quiet of a round pen at Larkspur Ranch. It was Elle, of all people, who talked him into it. She trusted you in a thunderstorm, Jess, Earl said. I think you're underestimating what that mare's capable of. Question is whether you trust yourself enough to be up there with her. The night of the fair came clear and warm, the grandstand lights buzzing against a purple sky, and Jess led Grace toward the arena gate with his heart hammering harder than it had in years. She felt it too, he could see it in the tightness of her neck, the way her ears kept swiveling toward the noise of the crowd, the announcer's voice booming over speakers not so different from the auctioneer's chant that had once decided she wasn't worth a single bid. For one long, terrible second at the gate, Grace planted her feet and refused to move, exactly the way she had refused to load into that trailer 3 months before. Jess didn't pull. He didn't push. He simply stood beside her, dropped the lead rope slack in his hand, and waited, the same patience that had brought her out of a trailer at 2 a.m, the same patience that had steadied her through a storm. Whenever you're ready, he murmured. Not before. 10 seconds passed. 20. The announcer, sensing the moment, quietly let the silence hold instead of filling it. And then Grace took a step forward. And another. And walked beside Jess Calloway into that lit-up arena in front of 400 strangers, head high, ears forward, moving like a horse who had finally decided the world might not be something to fear after all. What followed wasn't flashy. There were no tricks, no jumps, no music cued to a dramatic crescendo. It was simply a man and a mare moving together at liberty around an open arena, turns and stops and changes of direction communicated through nothing but posture and trust, the same quiet language Ellen had spent her whole life teaching Jess to speak. When Grace finally stopped in the center of the arena and lowered her head to rest against Jess's chest, the grandstand went as silent as that sale barn had 3 months earlier. But this silence was different. This one didn't press down. It lifted. Somebody started clapping first, nobody could ever agree afterward exactly who, and then the whole grandstand rose to its feet, and the sound of it rolled over that arena like something Jess hadn't let himself feel in far too long. Not pity. Not curiosity. Just plain, overwhelming admiration for a horse who had been told she was a lost cause, and a man who had refused to believe it. By the end of that season, Larkspur Ranch wasn't quiet anymore. Word of Grace's story brought calls from 3 different families asking about adopting horses of their own from sale barns and rescue lots, and Jess, slowly, carefully, with Grace often standing nearby as a kind of silent proof that it was possible, started helping them do it. The empty stalls that had haunted him for 2 years began filling again, not with reminders of what he'd lost, but with new stories still being written. Grace never became a show horse or a barrel racer or anything you'd find in a record book. She didn't need to. Most mornings, she was simply the first face waiting at the pasture fence when Jess came out with the feed bucket, the scars on her flank fading a little more each season, the wariness in her eye long since replaced by something steadier. Jess still keeps her registration papers in that same box, alongside a photograph of Ellen standing beside a leggy young filly not yet a year old. Some nights, he says, he swears Grace looks at that photograph the same way he does, like she remembers, in whatever way a horse remembers, the hands that first loved her before the world tried to convince her she wasn't worth loving at all. There's a particular kind of magic in a story like this one, the kind that reminds you an animal nobody wanted, and a man nobody expected anything more from, can find their way back to each other against every possible odd. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved everyone in that grandstand, we'd love to hear which moment hit you hardest down in the comments. And if you believe every lost cause deserves one more chance to prove the world wrong, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss the next one, because out there, right now, there's another Grace standing in another sale barn, waiting for somebody brave enough to refuse to walk away.